Welcome to Our College Your Voices. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. This week we have 2 episodes for you. These episodes are the first of our series of conversations with colleagues from around the state about the book So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. We'll be bringing you the conversations mostly in their entirety, editing only for flow and where participants requested that something not be placed in the public conversation. I want to thank everyone who participated in these conversations. These talks are hard, but we must have them if we're going to dismantle systemic racism in our country and in our college. I invite you to think through these conversations with us. And if you find yourself uncomfortable, I encourage you to sit with the discomfort. Don't walk away from it. If we're going to make change, we all have to get a little uncomfortable.
All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad we're here to start our conversation about So You Want to Talk About Race. And we're going to start in the introduction. And I'm looking at the hard copy book. I'm going to start with a quote off of page 6. And this quote, I think, just talks about sort of why we're all here. It says, these conversations, and she means these conversations about race and racism, will not be easy, but they will get easier over time. We have to commit to the process if we want to address race, racism, and racial oppression in our society. And so I start by commending you all for joining me as we try to do that together at Ivy Tech and more broadly, and just open up the conversation to what you found really valuable or meaningful to you in the introduction as we get started today.
One thing that got my attention in the introduction on page 6 of the softback cover, she said, everything starts with conversation. And that struck me because it makes perfect sense, but that's also kind of how I roll too. Like, let's just talk about it. Like, that's how I approach everything. Let's just talk about it. So I really appreciated that she's starting at a place where I think we all can kind of come to comfortably because it's familiar to us. And I appreciated that.
This is Stephanie Williams. I think with the introduction, I wrote some notes, and the big thing, I think the big statement that I wrote was on page 6, where it says there is real pain in our racially oppressive system, pain that I as a Black woman feel. And my note there was the worst pain is knowing that valid mainstream systems are intentionally trying to harm me and my family. Mm-hmm. So that's I think that kind of, in a nutshell, when it comes to systemic racism, how I feel about, the introduction and the overall topic as a Black person.
Absolutely.
So this is Neil from Columbus. I wanted to point out to me on page 8 of the introduction was that after a lot of conversations that went nowhere, she writes, quite honestly, this book is giving people basically something she created that could be useful. So she's giving us almost like a toolkit after we get through the book on how to talk about race and make change besides just conversations. So I wrote in capital letters, this is something of use, what I got out of the preface.
And something from the introduction that I thought was interesting that I made a note of, she says that my race has been one of the most defining forces in my life. And I just thought, that's so true for Black people and most non-white people, that it's something you think about all the time, every day. And I think a lot of uncomfort that comes with conversations like this is that most people that identify as white don't think about their race, or I think good-hearted people don't think that they think about other people's races. And so that really stuck out to me in the introduction.
I think something that really stuck out to me from the introduction was that, here she is writing this book as a Black queer woman, but she still put herself out there to be vulnerable, to talk about the things that she wished she would have done in this book. Mm-hmm. And I think that just goes to show that she's like, everyone is going to have trouble and make stumbles along the way when we're trying to work through this together.
And Amanda, building on that, the amount of courage it takes for someone in a vulnerable population, an oppressed population, to tell their story and to be a spokesperson is just incredible to me.
Absolutely.
I appreciated in the introduction how she mentioned perspectives. And I thought it was really interesting, just even from things that we teach our students about identity and perspective, and how just because it isn't true for you doesn't mean it's not true for somebody else. And I see that happen so often, even if we just look at it from a strengths perspective. You know, what the way we view things isn't the same way other people view things. And we can also take that to the bigger picture of what's happening right now in our culture with the pandemic. Just because we haven't experienced something doesn't mean other people have or haven't. So I think that to me spoke volumes, because people are quick to say, oh, no, that's not true.
There's a passage early on, and I apologize, I'm actually using an ebook. So any page number that I reference is going to be wrong. So, but as I was reading where, there's a passage about pain, but then there's a passage right after that says, like many people, most of my days were spent just trying to get by. And, Kara, you and I know, and, that we just finished reading White Fragility, which is a very fine book, but this seemed to be, for me, as an African-American administrator currently dealing, with the challenges of a pandemic alongside the challenges of the social unrest we're experiencing all over the country. And that's exactly what I needed to read at this time. People ask me how I'm doing, and I'll say, well, I'm the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. I have responsibilities. But when further on in that paragraph, she says, it is very hard to survive as a woman of color in this world. And this was the part that really got to me. And I remember saying once that if I stopped to really feel the pain of the racism I encountered, I would start screaming and I would never stop.
Yeah.
And I remember, I highlighted that and I thought to myself, that is essentially what I think is kind of going on with a lot of us, right now, especially now. If you had to stop, and if we were not so busy trying to deal with everything else, and we just took a moment to think about all of this, there would be that sense of just screaming that would take place.
Can I ask how this book was chosen? Was it something that you read or a recommendation? Because it seems so fitting.
So thanks for asking that, Lauren. So I bought this book for myself probably 6 months ago, and it had been on my, my to read stack, which is ridiculously long. And I sent out one of the first Thursday emails or semi-weekly emails where I included a diversity spotlight in it. And another faculty member came back and said, it's great what you're doing, but you didn't let the voices of the people who are experiencing pain speak. And that's what we've got to make space for that. We've got to make space for voices of color to actually tell the story. And that faculty member actually suggested the book. And so that it was like, okay, I've got to read this. And so then decided we needed to read it together. So that's how it came to be. I really appreciated on page 5 where she talked about the rise of voices of color and what, with all the ills of the media, what social media and the internet has allowed to be brought up and brought out and made more open to, as she said, it's brought the urgency of racism in America to the forefront of all of our consciousness. Race is not something people can choose to ignore anymore. And I thought that was really powerful.
Another thing that really rang true to me in the introduction was these are very scary times for a lot of people who are just now realizing that America is not and has never been the melting pot utopia that their parents and teachers told them it was.
Yeah.
And I just, because I think about that a lot. And even in some of my own conversations as being a Black person, talking to, other people that have been marginalized. And it's kind of shocking to hear someone criticize, a country that your whole life you've been told that everybody wants to come here, everybody wants to live like us, everybody wants to be like us. And like anything we've done wrong, that was in the past. And we've learned from that and we're over it now. So I think we're seeing it a lot now, that it is jarring for people. And it's something that a lot of people can't accept, that there's still injustices happening and that are ingrained into our society. And that we have to confront them in order to make them better.
Absolutely.
And I think that it's probably a bit harder to have those conversations now when there is this bizarre sense of patriotism that's permeating so much of American society. This notion that, America first. Recently, I've been seeing these commercials about the Great American Comeback, and just, how do we then engage in conversations like this about racism when we juxtapose that with this notion that we're this supposed great country. I appreciate you bringing that point up.
Lauren, or everyone, but I also underline these are very scary times on page 5 for those who are just now realizing how justifiably hurt, angry, and terrified so many people of color have been all along. And my note on the side of that was European Americans will suffer relationship loss of unfair gain. And so what I meant by that was, it's okay. I think it's been okay to not think about it. If you don't have to think about it, then you don't have to think about your own unfair privileges and, financial gains and things like that. And, you can kind of throw off, what the possibly racist family member says at dinner time as just something stupid. So, I must say, even though, there's so much going on and people are beginning to listen, I am a little skeptical of real change happening because I think that in doing so, you're leveling the playing field. And I don't really know if European Americans are ready to level the playing field and allow other people of other ethnicities to also have a shot at being successful and, being leaders and having financial gain as well, because they see it as if you get that high paying position, then that's one less job for, a European American like myself. The whole, the wall and things like that was about jobs. It's about money. So I really don't know if there's real change that's going to happen. I'm a little skeptical as an African American. I'm a little skeptical.
One of the things I think is interesting about it, though, going along with what you said, but also what it says in the text about stressful for people of color who've been fighting and yelling and trying to protect themselves. I think one of the things that has helped in this situation is the smartphone and social media. So now with everything potentially being recorded and in your face all the time, the idea that you're going to keep seeing it, and the fact that we had to watch for generations Black people die, and now it's 2020, and now suddenly it's become a concern. Some change needs to happen, and it better happen. And people are going to continue to record. And yes, I've been screaming and yelling and fighting my whole life, and I'm not going to stop, even though I'm exhausted from doing it and talking about it all the time, so that we can get that change. And it is one of those feelings that you have where it's like, because it's been ingrained for so long, it's going to be extremely difficult to get things to move in a direction that does, using your language, level the playing field. Mm-hmm. And that scares people who have benefited from the structure for so long. So you're combating that, and you're combating the stress, and you're also looking over and over again on the news and on social media, these things that are happening. And something has to come out of all of that will improve the situation.
Octavia, I wonder if you've had similar experiences. I'm obviously white, so when all of this started to happen, I went to one of my best friends who's a person of color, and I said, "Oh my gosh, this is horrible, and what do we do, and what can I do, and how are you?" And just thinking, let's help me understand. She looked me in the eye and she said, "Steph, I'm tired. I've been fighting this battle my whole life, and now all of a sudden, all of you, well-meaning white folks," and she meant that as a joke, but she said, "It's not my job to educate you. You need to go read books and do research." And she said, I appreciate your intentions, but I'm tired. I can't do it anymore." Have you had similar experiences, Octavia, or have you felt that way?
Yeah, ultimately the question comes down to, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do.
Mhm.
And just listening as we were going through the introductions, and I was like, wow, there are a lot of chairs and vice chancellors sitting in this place who are in positions of power who can immediately do things
Right.
to make it better across the board for all of us.
Yes.
And then for our students, and then the students get uplifted, and then the communities get uplifted. And all of those things are cyclical and feed back into each other positively. And so that's a thing right off the bat that I always tell people. Use your power immediately. Don't be quiet, because when you're quiet, you're more or less promoting the problem. But if you are speaking up, if you are in your meetings and you're saying, this policy, or the fact that we're not making a multicultural class for education students a requirement, that's a problem. We need to fix that. The fact that we are not recruiting in certain communities, when you have those kinds of powers, those are the things that you can do right away. And then, we can come back and we can have a chit chat about other things and, what's on your mind and how you feel. But ultimately, it boils down to, if you want to do something to help the problem, start with the places where your talents already lie and go in and go to work, because that's what we've been doing all of this time. I say the activists collectively, we're always working all the time on those things. The more people we have, the greater the expansion of that activism becomes, and the more likely we can make that change happen, because I'm not going to be quiet ever. And so I'm just going to keep pressing you about it. What are you doing? What did you say in the meeting? What happened? Did you change this policy? Is the curriculum changing, et cetera, et cetera? So you can use your positions right away and get work done.
So this is a great way to expand into chapter 1 and to add it in, because chapter 1, the title is it really about race? And so many of the themes in chapter 1 are about the social structure of racism. I'm going to start with a different quote here this time than I did earlier. Often being a person of color in white dominated society is like being in an abusive relationship with the world. It's on page 19 if you're in the hard copy book. And I think that's another way of saying some of the things, Octavia and Stephanie and Rod, that you have said, that we've been beaten up by this, and it's nice that all you white people are finally paying attention, but now do something about it. So there's just so much, and there's so much in the book, but a lot in chapter 1. So let's expand our conversation into there.
Like I'm in my head a lot here, because I feel a lot of shame and guilt. I don't want to center the conversation around my bad feelings, but because a big part of it has been my willingness to not have conversations, to know that there's a problem.
Yeah.
As a liberal progressive fellow who cares about social justice and knows that there's issues, and I'm not sitting down and challenging my white family and friends to have conversations, and I need to do better. In this particular context, I'm thinking a lot about hearing, not being, not putting myself out there and being a person who's talking. I'm just wanting to listen, and then I'm thinking, well, then I'm not practicing talking. I need to try saying things. It's just so much mental stuff that can get in the way of just doing the practice and engaging in the work.
I think to your point, Benjamin, I find it interesting how in chapter 1, she encourages not just to challenge, like if you're challenging one person or you're having a conversation, that it doesn't just stop with you challenging that person directly, but extending it to the systemic issues. And I really acknowledge that I will have to practice that, to make it something that's more natural, because I can challenge one person directly, but then to extend it to the bigger issues beyond is going to take some intentionality that, I am hopeful that I'll be able to do. But I see this a lot in social media as well, where people will go directly with one other person when really we need to take that beyond the scope of just our one-on-one interactions.
Kara, I just want to say that you started the chapter 1 conversation off with probably one of the most powerful quotes that she wrote, when she said that being a person of color in white dominance in white dominated society is like being in an abusive relationship with the world. As a person who has experienced abuse, child abuse, I would say that is very fitting. And it's like when you know that when you're experiencing racism or being prejudiced against, it's very hurtful. And it's probably more hurtful than physical because it messes with, of course, your mind. That's something that you emotionally feel. And I was just talking to my husband this morning, and he was telling me about his experience just this morning with racism, where he said that he needed to walk behind the counter. This is at work to do business, and an ally or European American said, "Hey, you can go back there," and so he went back behind the counter to do his business, and the person said, "Hey, the rule is you're not supposed to be back there." And his European American friend said, "Well, wait a minute, you just let so-and-so go back there 20 minutes ago, so why can't you let him go back there?" And he said that she just turned beet red and was embarrassed because she had been caught. The person that she let come back there just 20 minutes before was a European American. And so, it was just like, what do you do when those instances happen at work or in your everyday life? And it's just something that we just constantly deal with. It's hurtful.
The abuse, I underline that passage too, but what really stuck out to me was it's the abuse of microaggressions, but it's also the abuse of the gaslighting that occurs almost every single day in every single interaction, in many interactions. One of my favorite parts of this chapter is where she breaks down, and again, no page numbers here for me, but where she breaks down, where she says, if you were looking for a simple way to determine if something is about race, here are some basic rules. And when I say basic, I mean basic. Mm-hmm. And the very first one she says is, if it is about race, if a person of color thinks it is about race.
Yep.
I don't think I've ever read a passage that clear and then fully explained later on that really got to the heart of it. I can tell you that as someone who recently moved to the suburbs of Indianapolis and was challenged in his own neighborhood about whether or not he lived there. I was actually stopped by a fellow resident who later then tripped over his word and said, well, I thought that you were delivering something to my house. And then as I continued to talk more, and I said, sir, I live in this neighborhood. And then he said, well, yes, I know you do. And then I said, then why would you think that I would be delivering something to your house? It was a very stupid conversation, in my opinion. But then he saw that I was getting agitated and then challenged me on my emotional reaction. And that was the kicker, where he said, I don't see why you're getting so upset about this. Mm-hmm. And so all of this kind of pulled together for me. And, and this was before I read this book. So that constant gaslighting of like, no, it's not about race. The other person was just having a bad day. She's just rude to everybody, whatever. It was very affirming to read something like this, in this chapter.
Rod, I agree that first rule that she laid out is incredibly powerful. I think I found it to really sum up that idea of impact versus intent just so clearly. I appreciated it because it gave me a little bit of vocabulary to think about, as a white person in situations where you misspeak or you say something that you want to be interpreted in a positive way, or you truly believe are good. It really truly doesn't matter if the impact is different than that, and kind of highlighting how, the role in that position is to step back and listen and understand how you've made a mistake, and not to get defensive and say, oh, but that's not what I meant.
Yeah.
Agree with that, Rod. I thought that was such a powerful point. The way that she broke that down was so great. And just to add another point from chapter 1, something that I've never thought about necessarily in this way. When she talks about, why do you think Black people are poor? Do you think Black people are poor for the same reasons that white people are poor? Even though the causes of the effects of poverty may look the same on the outside, the root causes of them are different. And so only talking about class or just putting policies in place that only are designed to impact class will not affect everyone equally. So I thought that was so interesting because class always, just like she writes, comes up as, well, it's not about race, it's about class. So I thought that was really interesting.
Lauren, Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. I think it's in The Atlantic. I will link to it in the show notes as a part of the conversation. If folks haven't read it, it's a really good introductory conversation about why the economic disadvantages that Black people face and people of color face, it is designed by the racist system in the US. It's such a good article if folks have not read that yet. So I will link to that in the show notes.
Kara, your comment reminded me of the lines in chapter 1 that got my attention. This is on page 21. She says, but race was designed to be interwoven into our social, political, and economic systems. And that got my attention because so many people say, oh, but I'm not racist. It doesn't affect me. I'm not racist. But we all participate in a racist system. So that's what we have to, one of the things that we need to talk about too. And as a community, figure out solutions for that also. And
what I found was extremely powerful in chapter 1 was just the whole idea that this race construct is a social construct. It's not biological, but it's literally made up, so that you could kind of classify people and put people in a place of status or in a lower status or whatever. And so what I have been trying to do and kind of retrain myself, because we all know as educators, we know that there's only one race, and that's the human race. There really isn't, before it was black and white and brown and red, these basic colors used to classify human beings. The racist leaders, I guess you could say, came up with the terms of Negroid and Mongoloid and Caucasoid. And, I guess that didn't catch on. So then they decided to just, use basic colors. And I'm just really trying to be intentional. Me personally, I don't get offended if no one else, if you're still saying white, black, whatever. But just me personally, I'm trying to retrain my mind not to participate in that classification system and just go by ethnicities. And so that's why you hear me saying European American and, I try to say African American. Sometimes I'll flip and say black, even though my skin color is brown. But I'm in the process of retraining my mind and my speech to not even participate and legitimize that made up social construct.
I agree with you, Stephanie, that their race, of course, is a social construct. And I think that sometimes, and you're not doing this at all, I think sometimes well-meaning people use that to say, I don't see race. Like, I don't see color at all. We're all one race. We're all the same. And again, those people are well-meaning. But one, that's not possible because we're just because of the world that we live in. And also, there's nothing wrong with celebrating, your heritage and your culture, just the same way that, people whose ancestors are from Ireland or Scotland or any of those things want to celebrate where they come from and their legacy. I don't think there's anything wrong with, celebrating your culture and being happy to identify the way that you identify. But I heard a quote recently that kind of spoke to this that I try to repeat is that if you don't see race, then you don't see discrimination. And I thought that was really, really powerful.
So let's go ahead and expand into chapter 2. And the title of chapter 2 is What is Racism? And I I'm a word nerd, and we had that hashtag going in the chat in the first conversation about this. So I'm going to start in the most obvious place, which is page 26. Probably one of the most telling signs that we have problems talking about race in America is the fact that we can't even agree on what the definition of racism actually is. And I'm going to add, just for the recording purposes, that the definition she chooses to use for the purpose of the book is racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race when those views are reinforced by systems of power. And so that's the definition of racism that she'll use for the book. So let's continue our conversation and add in chapter 2.
I'll just say that, again, I think the way that the two definitions of racism are very apt at this time, especially. I don't know if you guys have heard about some of the stuff people are discussing around Nick Cannon and the comments that he has made recently. And just looking at Twitter and, people calling, he's a racist. And so then there's people going back and forth, posting the definition of racism from the dictionary. And again, just debates going on about what does racism really mean. And so it was great that she clarified it. And yeah, as someone mentioned, connecting it to the systematic structures that are in place that really should, whether it's that word racism or we need, some other kind of word that's separate from that, but that should really be where the discussion is because of the impact that it can actually have on individual people in a community.
Lauren, I don't know what, I'm glad you brought up Nick Cannon. I don't know what he said, but I was talking to my husband just last night, and we were just saying how we don't understand how and why you have African Americans going after Jews and saying anti-Semitic language, saying anti-Semitic things. The only thing I could chalk it up as is hurt people, like abuse people become abusers. I don't understand it. I literally, those were my words last night. Like, I don't get it.
Yeah, me either. I didn't even watch whatever it is that he said, just looking at comments. But yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. Okay. I thought it was just me. I'm like, what am I missing? It's weird.
One of the voices that really pay attention to a lot is Michael Harriot, who writes for The Root. And he just wrote an article about Nick Cannon this morning. You should go look at Michael Harriot. I recommend everybody, especially white folks, follow him on Twitter. And he's got a lot of very powerful things to say. But I think his explanation for it, if I'm correct in summarizing, is Black folks have had to work pretty hard to think of credible explanation for white people or why white people are so terrible. And so, yeah, there's some crazy theories out there that he's kind of into a lot, I guess. That's what Michael Harriot was saying. But, how else can you explain why white people have been treating their fellow citizens so badly for so many years?
The one thing that stood out to me was the passage that said, what is important is that the impotent hatred of the virulent racist was built and nurtured by a system that is much more insidiously woven a quieter, yet no less violent version of those same oppressive beliefs into the fabric of our society. And I was talking with a group of my friends recently, and one of the women is from Greenfield, and she said that her parents would tell her stories that, back decades ago, they would see people in hoods from the KKK marching around the courthouse. And we were talking about how, while that is horrible, at least you could easily point to that and say, those are the racists. And now it is much more quiet. It's much more hidden. You can't easily say, this person is racist or this group is racist. And it's just kind of hidden and reinforced by people who aren't willing to dig in and try to see, maybe where those kinds of things still are living and existing.
What's even more scary about people marching around saying KKK and in hoods, that in and of itself does not bother me as an African American. But what further bothers me is that there's a whole system that protects them in the case that if they do decide to attack myself or my family, that there's a good chance that they won't be punished for it. That part the systemic part that validates them and that confirms them is what scares me. I think there's a case down in Bloomington. There's an African American man who was attacked by racist European Americans, and that was on video. And there's an investigation. Didn't you just see the video? Mm-hmm. But if the roles were reversed, that African American would immediately be handcuffed and charged, and charged with assault. That's the least thing you could visually see. But instead, these people are still walking around free. That is the scary part, the systemic oppression of the bad behavior. That's scarier than the behavior itself.
Yeah, that's that victim blaming concept.
Yeah.
Things that are happening to you are happening because it's your fault.
Right.
Blackness has been equated with negativity and being a criminal and all of those other things. And because that ideology has been perpetuated all of this time, then it turns into, well, if you wouldn't have put yourself in this situation, this wouldn't happen to you.
Right.
If you just pick yourself up by your bootstraps, you could have anything else like everybody else does. And they're missing that piece. And I think I like what she said on page 25, where she's quoting her colleague. You can't just go around calling anything racist, save that word for the big stuff. And the big stuff and the racist abuse, the perpetual wave that is hitting us day in and day out is just as bad as the big stuff. Mm-hmm. And so that whole idea of trying to turn things on their heads to move the onus away from what is really happening to people is problematic. And that's what distracts us from getting the work done that we need to get done to get rid of the systemic, all of those underlying things that play into what create poverty and what prevents us from being able to vote, marginalization in communities, for resources going into education and all of those kinds of things. That's all racist work. All of it is racist work. And that's to me, that's just as much big stuff as, somebody in the hood in the Klan, or somebody pinning a brother up against a tree because, he walked through their yard, or whatever the case may be. And everybody has to own it, and everybody has to be responsible for doing something about it.
Yep. There's something at the top of page 26 about how white people want to be protected from their racist acts. She says it seemed far more important to him, which is the friend that was clearly not a friend, who said something racist to her. It was far more important to him that the white people who were spreading and upholding racism be spared the effects of being called racist, rather than sparing his Black friend the effects of that racism. And I think I know I've been guilty of that. And I'll just own that I have done that. And it's one of those things that I'm like, no, if I'm called on this now, I'm going to accept that. And I'm going to try to learn from that experience and move on. And that is a mind shift that all of us who are white have to make if we're going to ever make change in this system. So let's add in chapter 3 here. And chapter 3 is called, What If I Talk About Race Wrong? And I'm going to start with something from page 45, which I need to bring closer to myself because I couldn't see it where I would have my book sitting. So on page 45, she says, you're going to screw this up. You're going to screw this up royally more than once. And I think we all need to remember that as we try to have conversations about race, and we try to talk about it. So let's expand our conversation to include chapter 3.
I particularly loved that line that you spoke about, Kara, because I think that it gives people who are scared to start to have this conversation permission to try to start to have this conversation, right? It really hits at the heart of, you can't not talk about these things, and you can't sit in silence out of fear, because that fear is going to make it so that you never start to have these conversations. And for many of us, having the privilege to not have these conversations is going to actively be harmful to other people. And so we have to acknowledge that even though it's going to be scary, and we're going to have to be educated as we try to, start this work or continue this work, it's incredibly important to do that.
I love what you just said. I think that's the mindset that allies of social justice. That's exactly the mindset that you have to have. Just from my own perspective, and I hate to bring this up, but as a Christian, for me, and the way that I think, God is my provider. He's all of our providers, so don't be afraid that, you're not going to have a job. You probably hear people say, what's for me is for me. So I don't know. I think when you answer to a higher power, it's a little easier to treat people fairly and to just believe and trust that everything will be fine, that, everyone will be taken care of. I'll have what I'm supposed to have. My family will have what they're supposed to have. My grandchildren, my children, it will be fine, to be fair to everyone. It's probably not easy, it's not easy to think that way because, I guess who wouldn't want an advantage, a financial advantage for generations and generations to generations? Who wouldn't want that? So if you focus on that, yeah, that's fine. But then when you look at the other part, well, by me having these advantages, other people are hurting. So when you look at the other side of it, I think it probably makes it a little bit easier to kind of let go of that privilege. I guess I wouldn't know. As an African American woman, I wouldn't know.
No, I enjoyed the conversation in this chapter that with the mother. I thought it was so interesting that the author, this is her work to write about race, and her mother is white, and she identifies as Black, and they don't talk about race, and that this is one of the first in-depth conversations that they've really had about it, in the way that she describes it and how uncomfortable she felt about what her mother said, was going to say, and then ended up saying, and the conversation that pursued. Thought was so interesting, and in trying to have some of these conversations with white people, or people that are not of color. I wish I was more like Octavia. I wish I was more very comfortable and very confident in everything, because all I know is what I feel in my experience and the people around me. I don't I haven't read a ton of books like this to give me tools on all of the data and statistics and what to say in those conversations when people bring up class and other things and how to respond to it. So I know I always get uncomfortable because I worry that I'm going to get emotional, and that I worry that I'm going to look at people differently, that, realize you really don't understand, or you don't have my back at the end of the day, like she kind of points out in one of the chapters. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And two, kind of building on kind of living, being okay with being uncomfortable, and how you make other people uncomfortable. Because I think I go kind of the extra mile to make other people uncomfortable, to even be willing to have the conversation. Because like Octavia was saying, I have spent a lot of time thinking, what can I do in this moment? And what I can do is make sure I'm having conversations with the people around me, even though it's uncomfortable for me and for them at times. And I know I just, a few days ago was having a conversation with folks about, just homosexuality and their thoughts about that. And I just remember really, thinking these are the conversations that I'm asking people to have about race. And so you can't be afraid of making people uncomfortable or being uncomfortable yourself. It's so important to stand up and talk about what you believe in, just so, like she says, just so that you can plant a seed. And because I was thinking sometimes, what is the goal of this conversation? I may not change other, people's minds or, whatever. Is that my goal? What is my goal? But my goal is just to plant a seed that maybe, the next time they see something on TV, or the next time, somebody brings this up, that they'll think about it a little bit differently. Because, maybe something I said challenged the way they thought about, one aspect of it.
One of the things that I think when I hear about being comfortable or not comfortable is every time I found myself in one of these situations where I am incredibly uncomfortable, I remind myself that it means I'm on the cusp of learning something important. And that is how I try to communicate with other people about this, and actually even say to them, I know this is a difficult conversation. I'm uncomfortable.
and this is how I view comfort and discomfort. And it really does give me that skill set to take the conversation further. Is it always successful? No, I've gone into those really bad conversations that don't end well, like she describes in here. And I'm guilty of walking away and just not wanting to go back to that person, like she says, but keep reminding myself it's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to know that you've done something that affected somebody negatively and own it.
I was just going to chime in and say that I was encouraged because I think it just gave me the freedom to fail, right? So many times, at least for me in my experiences as an educator for educators, I'm not really, you have this idea that you want the conversation to go right. You want everything, we're trained as teachers, at least for the K-12 system, to make sure that you're presenting information well to students so they can learn that information. You want to be a content expert on the front end so you don't confuse them. And so those of us who want to ally and rally around people of color who are not a person of color like myself, I think sometimes that's the struggle, right? And I really appreciated the author's approach to giving us not only some very simple tools to get us started, at least through chapter 4, but also the freedom to fail at that, which is, I think, one of the reasons we sometimes won't go there. We're afraid to fail. We're afraid it's going to do more harm than good. I know that's been a fear of mine in the classroom over the years, and I'm trying to find what that looks like. So anyway, I say all that to just, I felt encouraged by her words and the freedom to give it a shot, and then know that if you do some damage, give it some time and come back and try again. And for me, that meant a lot.
And that's the key. You have to go back.
Yeah.
If it doesn't go well, if you got cussed out, you chalk it up and you say, okay, we're going to try this again with a different approach. And a lot of times people say, well, that didn't go well, I'm done. I don't want to talk about that anymore. And they walk away and they never revisit it again. And everything stalls out. You stall out the relationship, you stall out the opportunity. Like if you're in class for students to learn, and on the same side, well, on the other side of it, trying to get people to understand. And as she may have spoke about it earlier in the book, I'm trying to give you this information so that you can be enlightened about what is happening to Black people. And you're not listening to me. And then you get enraged and you get defensive. And then that doesn't go well either. You have to go back. You have to revisit it. And then it's the revisit that's the hard part, because you have to clear the air again first. And then, okay, let's take it from a different angle. And it takes a great degree of courage to be able to do that. And you just have to prepare yourselves for that part of the battle.
I really appreciated that she included the tip of apologizing, but I especially appreciated that she included the part of and mean it. Because you can apologize and apologize and apologize, but if you keep having to apologize, you're not trying to change your behavior at all. So that, I found myself apologizing in these situations. And sometimes, I've even started trying when I'm having conversations to say at the very beginning of the conversation, I know I'm going to mess this up. I know I'm going to make mistakes. So I just want to go into this saying that, knowing that I still have a lot to learn.
I also thought about the feedback section, and as me in a position of power as a white leader, and going back to what Stephanie was talking about at the beginning of this dialogue, where she went to her friend of color and her friend told her she was exhausted because she's been responding to this over and over again. And I think, we definitely have a responsibility to receive feedback and apologize for our mistakes. But I think we also have a responsibility to do some of that emotional labor then too, when we see somebody else make a mistake. And I think I can say, at least for myself, for a long time, I've silently judged people who have said things in interview committees or any kind of meeting, and just been like, I can't believe I said that. And really, understanding our responsibility as white allies to come alongside our white friends and talk to them about how what they're saying is hurtful and provide them that feedback and invite them into the conversation rather than silently calling them out.
I think I'm listening to what everyone is saying, and this wasn't going to be my comment, but I feel like African Americans should probably, we've been oppressed for a very long time. We've been hurt. We're tired, of talking about it. European Americans should know how we feel. But I do think that we need to understand that, these are some unique shoes that we walk in. And if someone doesn't, walk in our shoes, it may be a little hard for them to understand that you mean to tell me that you're afraid, your child will get shot on the way to a grocery store. That sounds ridiculous, but that's not their experience. So I do think that we probably should do a better job of creating a climate of acceptance coming from our European American allies. And, when they're trying to find out about who we are and what is going on, what is this all about? I'm totally oblivious to what's happening. Help me understand. We probably could do a better job in being more open to the mistakes that are going to be made, because this is a new dialogue that many of us are entering into with each other. So I think on both sides, we probably should give each other grace. But what I was going to say, what I would hope everyone realizes from this book is that not everyone is free in America. On page 37 of chapter 3, she says that her mom told her that you can't challenge the cops. Don't be surprised if you're followed at stores. Some people will be mean to you because of your beautiful brown skin. No, you can't have that same hairstyle. And it's like, you can't do this, you can't do that. 4th of July weekend, I wanted to go to Lake Monroe. But you know what? I told my family, we can't go there, not in this climate. My kids, we have a beautiful trail by our house that's wooded on both sides. No, my 2 African American sons, no, you cannot run that trail anymore. No, you can't bike it because you may not come back. Someone could jump out. I'm literally telling them this. Someone could jump out from the woods and shoot you and kill you and say, that you attacked them. You can't do that. There's not enough people on the trail. When we say the Pledge of Allegiance, when we're taught that, is liberty and justice for all. And right now, there isn't. If you're a true patriot, you'll understand that there isn't liberty and justice for all. We can't freely go where we want to go. We can't freely do what we want to do because we might get killed. We literally may get killed or imprisoned. So I think what I would love for European Americans to understand is that we're not free. You have liberty, but we don't.
Stephanie, I was kind of smiling as you were talking because some of I don't like the term foodie. I hate that term, but folks know that I like to. Folks know that I like to go to different restaurants, and I'll take a look sometimes at some of the places to go. Because a lot of people don't want to get on planes. I'm one of them right now, looking for road trips and things like that. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll take a look at a recommendation from Indianapolis Monthly or some other publication that talks about these great restaurants all over the state of Indiana, and I'll look at these towns. And I'll read the reviews, and they'll say, "Oh, these are these one towns, and this in this small community, and if you drive too fast, you might miss it, and all this other stuff." And I read this, and I think to myself, "Yeah, on the one hand, this sounds like this would be a great excursion. On another hand, quite frankly, I don't want to be messed with. I don't want to go to some tiny town just so I can enjoy their food, recognizing that my partner and I will likely be the only people of color in a 50-mile radius, and what all of that suggests." And so, I appreciate, what you were saying as far as, kind of some of these restrictions or some of the privileges that, that perhaps as people of color, we do not have. I hear you.
It's real. It's real. And it's an extension of slavery. You know, we were supposedly freed on January 1st, 1863, but we are still, you know, enslaved, maybe not, you know, outside of our brothers and sisters who've been unfairly imprisoned, unfairly, you know, outside of them, the rest of us are imprisoned in our minds. You know, I could have gone possibly to Lake Monroe and had a fabulous time, but I had to restrict myself and my family because I wasn't sure we were going to be safe. And if we weren't safe, there isn't a certainty that there will be a consequence happen if someone did mess with us. So we chose to go to Eagle Creek. We stayed in Indianapolis just simply because we're like, well, European Americans here in Indianapolis have more experience with African Americans, so we're probably less likely to be messed with here than, as what Rod was saying, in a small town, you know, down in southern Indiana.
I'm going to expand the conversation on into chapter 4, which is entitled, Why Am I Always Being Told to Check My Privilege? And, you know, from the context of a white person, what you're talking about is the privilege that we have. I don't have to have those kinds of conversations with my children. I don't have children, with my nieces and nephews or with my family. I don't have to think when I get in the car, am I going to get pulled over for driving while Black? I don't have to have that dialogue constantly running in my head. That's the privilege of being born in America with white skin. And there's the quote I want to start with on page 60 is from page 63. The concept of privilege violates everything we've been told about fairness and everything we've been told about the American dream of hard work paying off and good things happening to good people. She goes on to say, the concept of privilege makes the world seem less safe. We want to protect our vision of a world that is fair and kind and predictable. That reaction is natural, but it doesn't make the harmful effects of unexamined privilege less real.
So, Kara, this is Russ Baker. I mentioned in my introduction in Zoom that I'm one of the many people who grew up not thinking I had any significant privilege. We weren't economically advantaged, and race wasn't really part of my, it wasn't something I thought about because, like many Caucasian people, I didn't think about race because everyone around me pretty much shared my race, and so it just wasn't part of my consciousness. So this whole idea of thinking of myself as privileged is something that has been a journey, and several other people talked about this as well in their introduction, so I know I'm not alone in this. But I think one of the most eye-opening parts of reading the book White Privilege, which several of us have done prior to this book we're talking about now, is just grappling with the idea of there's a lot of different forms of privilege, and I had some that I didn't realize, and I've only begun to more recently understand that. So I guess that's what I wanted to say at this point on the issue of privilege.
I love that she asks you to not, when she asks you to list your privileges, and she says, you know, if you want to make a list of ways that you're not privileged, go ahead and do that. But right now, just focus on the ways that you're privileged. And I love that she forces us to do that, because I think that, at least in my experiences, people want to jump in and say kind of the thing, you know, Russ mentioned he didn't have maybe economic privilege. And I think that's kind of what a lot of white folk like to do is, you know, like I grew up poor, or I have a lot of childhood trauma, or I'm a woman, or, you know, and so I love that she asked us to not do that. And that was a really great exercise for me.
Me too.
I thought that was a great tool as well, because I teach a multicultural communication course, and students that struggle the most in that course when we get to this topic seem to be white males. And they just push back heavily on this idea of white privilege. And I utilize the article on unpacking your knapsack and then the further article about that as well. And I'm happy to share those resources in Ivy Learn. But it is shocking to me the number of people that just push back. And I can't help but take this conversation to how we help in our classrooms how we have this conversation, because it does get difficult to facilitate that dialogue when I am white talking to a white male.
I, again, appreciated the bravery and vulnerability that she showed in this chapter when she talked about the group that they formed in Seattle and when the young men playing basketball came up. And I mean, that had to be hard to say that. Or when she talked about, light-skinned versus darker-skinned African Americans, that's got to be hard to say.
Yeah, man, it was the first time that I had read those types of discussions within the context of talking about privilege and the broader context of talking about race. It's sometimes difficult even to have those conversations within, among African American, within an African American community, because, we talk so much about the wounds and the pains of racism, which are very, very real. And then the moment we try to have conversations about privilege, it's like, well, everything else trumps everything, the fact that we're Black trumps everything else. And I think to myself, that's probably true in a lot of contexts. But, if I, as an able-bodied, cisgendered Christian male within the United States, don't recognize his own privilege, then I think that does become, those do become issues as well. There's a later chapter that we talk about where we discuss intersectionality, which I think I'm really looking forward to that conversation as well.
I thought about, as she was doing that discussion, I was drawn to that conversation as well. And I thought about how, and I'd love for you all to check me on this because I don't know if this is right, but privilege is context based. In one audience, I may have this set of privileges. In another audience, I might have a different set of privileges. So there's a set that I just walk around with every day. But then in the group that I'm in at that moment, I have a different set of privileges. And it's powerful to think about. And it also, I think for me, helps me to maintain awareness of it at all times. What is my privilege right now? And how do I then use that to make the world better?
Kara, I think you're right. I think everything is context specific, but especially this. And I realized that too. I did the exercise. My husband and I listed our privileges. And I have to say, my understanding of privilege was fairly naive before. I'm a white, straight, cis girl, in Indiana. And I thought that was pretty much it. But there's a lot of ways that I'm privileged that I just hadn't thought about before this exercise. And I think for us as educators, we need to keep that in mind, not just because it's the right thing to do and it's the nice thing to do, and the appropriate thing to do, but we have privilege as instructors and professors, and that adds a layer, a contextual layer, as you said, Kara, in that relationship as well. So I think that's important to think about too.
And for me, that made me, like, when I was reading the different ways that they were talking about privilege, and they started talking about things like, are you tall, thin, and considered conventionally attractive? I'm like, no, but I hadn't even thought of those things as being.
Exactly.
I wouldn't have put those on a list.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, it sounds like our conversation's coming to a close. Anybody have last thoughts they want to share today?
Here, I just have one. This is Russ again. And this is kind of turning the name of the book on its, flipping it over. And I'm almost hesitant to say this, but we're all in this book club because we do want to talk about race, and we want to talk about it for, I think, regardless of our backgrounds, we want to talk about it in ways that are more informed and more appropriate, and that will help end divisions more than create new ones. But my question is this, and I feel I'm fortunate to have quite a few opportunities now to be in social situations where there are a mix of people, and sometimes where I'm the only Caucasian person among, a few others who are all African American. So when is it okay to not talk about race and just, I'm burdened right now by the fact I don't want to be trite, but I'm burdened by the fact that right now I feel like we're in a very difficult place as a country in a whole lot of ways. And several of you have talked about several of you who are African American have talked about how tiring and exhausting this is. And so as a Caucasian person, I don't want to always talk about race. Sometimes I just want to talk about, whether or not I like the drink I'm having. And so again, I know we're here to talk seriously about this issue, but when is it okay not to talk about race? I ask that as a question.
For me, as an African American woman, I think it's always appropriate. I mean, if it's to talk about race, I think if we can say that, if we have the power, I guess, to say that this is a racist situation, I think European Americans should have the privilege. If you feel like you want to talk about race, or you wonder if something has a racial connotation to it, if you feel the unction to talk about it, I think that you should be able to talk about it. So, I mean, that's my perspective. If you feel like you want to talk about it, I think you should talk about it.
Russ, can you clarify the question a little? So when is it okay to not talk about? You said sometimes you just want to talk about your drink. Is that what you said?
Yeah, I was being a little bit facetious, but my question is really, Lauren, I don't want to ignore the tough issues, but I think sometimes people of both races and all races want to just enjoy each other's company. And I'm sort of feeling like right now, if I have social situations where I don't acknowledge what's going on or talk about it, that it might appear to be insensitive. But I also don't want to always feel like whenever I'm in a mixed race company that we need to talk about really serious, heavy, racially inclined issues. I'm not articulating myself very well.
Does it have to do with a comfort thing, or I'm trying to get my mind wrapped around what it is that you're asking? If you're in a situation and you're in mixed ethnicity company and you're just talking about regular things, then the conversation, I would think, would just go that way. But if something is happening and, it's evident that there's a racial issue, and, maybe you're the one who brings it up in that particular conversation at that time, or if there's someone else who does, and you engage in a conversation about it. But if it's, oh, well, why do we always have to talk about race all the time? Like it's a tiresome thing. And it's like, well, guess what? Every day that I walk out the door, the conversation potentially could be about race because I wear a big afro, or because the way my voice sounds when I speak on the phone, or when I walk in the room and I'm the only Black person, which happens a lot in academia. And so I guess, I don't know, I'm kind of answering and asking you a question at the same time. What do you think would be a justifiable reason for not talking about it?
If I can jump in real quick, I think that it depends on the situation. Like if it's somebody that and that you're friends with, and you see all this, everything that's going on and happening, I think it's fine just to ask, how are you doing? With everything going on. And if they want to talk about it, then I hope you feel comfortable having that discussion with them and letting them talk to you about it. If it's people that you don't know at all, I don't think that you have a responsibility to start into everything in this book or anything like that. But I think allowing people of color, or Black people especially, to talk about how they're feeling during this time, especially if you're friends with them and care about them, I think that's a great thing. Because I don't often get the opportunity to have these kind of discussions with people that are not Black. And I've talked even with the people that I work with at Ivy Tech about that fact that these kind of discussions, I don't get to have that often because I don't have, most of the people around me, are Black or, have similar viewpoints that I do. And so it just depends. I think it depends on the situation.
Lauren, can I just say one more thing about what he was saying? If you're exasperated with what's going on, I can definitely understand. Everyone's talking about race, and every time you turn on CNN or the news, the issues about race. And if European Americans are exasperated by that, and that's very valid, just imagine how African Americans feel when we have to deal with race every single day. This is why you see, people burning down, cars and just going nuts. Alcoholism, drug abuse. Just imagine European Americans have been facing the racist issues intensely for about 3-4 months now. So imagine, though, a lifetime of having to face these issues every single day, day in, day out. It's exasperating. It's exhausting. It's terrorizing. It decripples you. It's crippleizing. It's horrible. So if whatever you're feeling, you can magnify that 1,000 for an African American, or maybe 10,000.
I really appreciate Lauren and all your comment about you're around people who have the same view as you. And one of the things I've thought about is how do we create safe spaces within our community for our colleagues and students of color to be able to be authentic and real and themselves. Because one of the great conversations I had as we launched this with a colleague by Teams is that she's a person of color and she doesn't feel safe at Ivy Tech being herself. And I thought that is what we've got to change. We've got to change that you have to be somebody different just to feel safe here, because that's completely unacceptable to me. And it's a daunting task, but it's one we've got to keep taking on and keep doing. Friends, thank you so much for being brave, for having this conversation, for engaging in it so honestly. And it has been just thought-provoking and wonderful. And I know some of you are going to join us for future conversations, and I look forward to that. I know some of you, this is the only one you can be in, and that's okay too. But I hope that you'll keep doing this work and you'll keep talking to each other, and know that you have allies amongst the people who are on this call to continue this conversation.
Thank you again for joining in on this episode of Our College, Your Voices. I want to again thank the members of today's panel. I won't list them all for you, but it takes a tremendous amount of bravery to have a conversation like this. So thank you again to everyone who was on the show. As you know, every one of our episodes ends with a call to action. And if you heard something in today's episode that made you a bit uncomfortable, I just ask you to find a colleague that you trust and have a conversation with them about it. Again, conversation is the first step. We have to move to action, but at least start the conversation. Thanks again for listening. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. You can connect with me on Twitter at KNM Tweets. You can reach us by email at ourcollegeyourvoices@ivytech.edu. Leave us a voicemail at 317-572-5049. Don't forget, if you're an Ivy Tech faculty or staff member, you can always join our Microsoft Teams listener community. Our website is ivytech.edu/podcast. Production assistance for this and every episode provided by Becky Campbell, Sarah Ferguson, and the Ivy Tech Community College marketing team. Our podcast concept is by Matthew Pittman. Theme music and post-production services are provided by Jen Eads at the Brassy Broadcasting Company. We'll talk to you next time on Our College, Your Voices.